Everybody, it's Courtney. I'm going to be using the Mom's Clematis stamp set, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. This is by Simon Says Stamp, and we are going to be doing a little bit of watercoloring here. I have this sped up by quite a bit just because I'm just showing you the placement that I chose for my images. I'm starting off with this smaller flower here, and I colored these, or I watercolor these as if they were lilies because to me they look like lilies. Stamping each of the images with Barely Beige ink, which is a waterproof ink, so you will still faintly see the lines. And I'm stamping these multiple times because this is textured cardstock. You won't necessarily get a great impression the first time, and for you guys to be able to see them a little bit better, I stamp them multiple times. I am using Eclipse masking paper here, and you can see that my masks are not perfectly cut. There are a ton of detail to these images with a lot of squiggly lines for the outline. So I'm not too concerned with getting a perfect mask here, just as long as it covers up a majority of my image so that I don't stamp directly over each of them. And you can see that I'm using this smaller lily twice. So once I stamp this down the second time, I didn't feel like cutting another mask because I'm lazy. So I just used that first mask to cover that up to finally go ahead and stamp out this little bud here. And then once that was done, we'll move right into the watercoloring. I'm going to be working on the waffle flower watercolor mat. And I'm going to be using my Arteza real brush pens here, but I'm going to be using them as watercolor rather than the pens themselves. So I'm just going to squish out some of this color into these little palette areas here on the mat. And I'm using the black and the gray. And I'm going to be starting off with my background first. So I'm using a number 2 round brush, and I'm just getting the area wet, damp, not soaking wet, because these are smaller areas. So I'm first starting to work around the little areas between the flowers and leaves, and then I'll take a little bit of that black with just the tip of the paintbrush and drop that in around the edges. And then if I do need to take a little bit of the gray to kind of fill that in, I will, if it doesn't spread as far as I need it to spread. So none of these areas are touching each other, so I don't necessarily have to worry about spreading them out too much, but I'm just kind of being careful as to not put my hand in it because I've done that more times than I can count. And I'm just working with the smaller areas first. So my paintbrush, you can see that I have a jar of water there, and I also have a paper towel. So each time I dip that in the water, I'm kind of dabbing off the base of the bristles, I guess, on the paper towel so that my paintbrush is not soaking wet. You don't want to have any puddles of water on your paper. You just want to have like a sheen of water when you drop this color in. And you can see that it spreads really nicely. Once I had all of those little tiny areas in between the flowers and leaves done, I'm going to work my way up to the top of the panel now. So I'm basically doing the same thing. First, I'm going to kind of outline the images with that number 2 brush because these are such fine detailed areas. And here you can see that, I'm hoping that you can see, I'm using quite a bit more water than I did the first time. Because I have such a large area to cover, I want this to stay wet, and it dries pretty quickly. So I'm going to switch over to a number 6. I think this is a number 6 round brush to kind of bring that color up a little bit, or bring that water up a little bit. And being I'm covering up such a large area, I wanted to use kind of a larger brush, but I do go back to that number 2 brush when I'm going around the images itself. But again, just dropping in that black a little bit, and then going in with a damp paintbrush again to kind of tap on a little additional water if it seems to be a little dry, so that it can help it kind of spread out and kind of soften up those areas a little bit. And you can see that I'm kind of working in sections here just because it is watercolor paper, so the water is going to kind of seep into the paper and dry fairly quickly. So rather than trying to work throughout the entire panel and having that happen, I just work in different sections, and then you'll see that I kind of go back and kind of make those areas meet up a little bit, if that makes any sense. So again, dropping in that black, letting that spread, and then I'll pick up a little bit of that gray and just kind of fill in some of those areas. You can see that I keep grabbing that Real Brush pen to add just a little bit more color or pigment down to my little palette there. And I'm just letting this kind of spread on its own. Now, I probably didn't add enough pigment. That was the problem. But I kind of let this do its own thing, which is for me very hard to do because I like to see results immediately. I'm so used to my Copics where I have my results right away. With watercolor, it's not so much. It's going to look different as it dries. So you kind of just have to let it do its thing, let it dry, and you'll see whether or not you need to go back in certain areas to fix that up. Now I did in the end, and you'll see later on that I did go back and fix up my background a little bit, but this is kind of just to get the base, see what it does. So here's where I'm going to switch over to that number 6 brush here, and I'm going to bring up that water a little bit further, or actually pretty much all the way. And I'm adding quite a bit of water here. So keep in mind that the more water you add, the more likely your paper is to warp a little bit. I'm okay with that because I'm going to end up gluing it flat down to a card base anyway. And I'm just letting the colors blend. Let them spread as far as they want to spread. You can see in certain areas that I am bringing in more of that gray. Now, my Arteza pens are old, very old. I think I purchased these when they first came out or when they first were known by card makers. So mine do not have colors labeled on them, but I will show you the caps as I go along, and hopefully you'll be able to kind of match those up if you do own these, but the black and the gray are pretty self-explanatory. So once my background was done, or at least done for now, we'll move on to the flowers. So I am using a yellow, kind of like a medium orange, and more of a brighter red. And again, just going to scribble out some of my color into my little palette here. And then I'm going to be working one petal at a time. First, I am going to take a little bit of that yellow and just fill in the centers of the flowers. And this is kind of optional at this point because I'm not really adding any detail at this point. I'm just kind of filling those in so that I don't lose them as I do my watercoloring. So once that was done and dry, I will start off with this flower off to the left-hand side. And we are going to, like I said, do one petal at a time. And I'm going to start by going every other petal because you don't want to work with 2 petals that are touching each other if they're still wet, because that color is going to spread from one petal to the next before you're ready to have that happen. So I'm going to go in with a damp paintbrush, as always, dabbing that off onto my paper towel just a little bit so it's not too soaking wet. And I'm going to pick up that yellow, and I'm going to cover up the entire petal with the exception of where it's folded over on itself. So that fold itself, I'm not filling in at this point. Just going to fill that in with yellow so you have your paper already damp. And then I'm going to drop in some of that orange where it would be the darkest. So at the base of the petal, at the tip of the petal, because I want this to appear as if it's kind of bowed out a little bit, and then also where it is folded over on itself. Next, I'm going to bring in just a little bit of that red, and I'm just using the tip of my paintbrush here to drop that into the center of the petal towards the base, the tip of the petal, and where that is folded over on itself. And you can see that sometimes I'm adding a little tiny bit more water just if I feel like my paper is not saturated enough. It's only going to spread as far as you put the water down, but you don't want to have a puddle. So I kind of let that sit, let it do its own thing like you have to do with watercolor, and I'm not getting a realistic look here. Primarily because I don't know how. I'm very, very new to watercoloring, and honestly, this is the first time I've watercolored with Arteza Real Brush pens the way I'm doing it now. I've used them as, you know, backgrounds and things like that, but as far as actually getting a watercolor look, I've never actually tried it, but I figured this would be a good stamp set to try. So again, just working with petals that are not touching each other, adding a little bit more water or softening up the edges once I put that red in. So if you go in with a damp paintbrush and just kind of tap over where you put that red, it will kind of spread out a little bit, but mostly just soften it, because I don't want these flowers to appear red. I do want them to look like tiger lilies, which are more of a bright orange. So moving on to the third petal here, again, just putting in that layer of yellow here, being careful not to touch the background where we had that black and gray. If you do, which I did, accidentally drag some of that black in, as long as it's still wet, just take your paper towel and dab up and down. Don't rub, just dab up and down, and you'll take most of that color away, and then you can just start over on that petal. So again, working every other petal, and now I'm going to go back and fix those little folds, or where the petal is folded over on itself, and I'm just going to go in with the orange because I want this to be a lighter area than the rest of the petal, because this would be more raised up, so it would be naturally be lighter than the petal it's laying over, or the rest of the petal that it's laying over, I should say. So once I have all of that done, you can see that I'm just touching up some of that background area that I wasn't too happy with. I had some harsh lines there. I just re-wet it and added a little bit more pigment, or a little bit more gray. So here I'm mixing just a little bit of the orange and red to make it not so red, but a little bit darker than that orange. So you can certainly mix these colors just like you would normally with regular watercolors. So now that those petals are dry, I can start to work on the other three petals, being they are not touching. So I'm doing the same thing here, just adding in my yellow and then adding in some of my orange, and then finally the red. I am also paying attention to the fact that first, actually, pause, we are going to take a quick Frankie break here. He is not allowed on the craft table when I'm doing any kind of watercoloring, but he didn't seem to care today. Finally got him down. Now I have a bunch of cat hair all over the place, but I made it work. But I'm also paying attention to the fact that some of these petals may be hanging over or under some of the other petals for the other flowers. Not only from the same flower, but other flowers as well. So I'm paying attention to make those areas a little bit darker to make sure that it appears to be a little bit of a shadow. So again, just going in with that damp paintbrush to kind of soften out some of that red. Once you put that red over that orange and the yellow, you're really not going to tell that it is red. Only a little bit of that yellow is actually going to be showing. You may not even be able to tell on camera, but you do see little bits and pieces of each of the petals where that yellow kind of shines through. And I do like to have that variation in color, because naturally I'm coloring them as tiger lilies, even though they're not. But they would naturally have all different colors kind of blended in with each of the petals. So you can see that I'm kind of just skipping over the middles at this point, the centers of the flowers. I'm going to get all three of the flowers done the same exact way as I did this one. We're just finishing up the last petal here, and then we're going to move on to the bud. So for the little flower bud here, I use the same color combination and pretty much colored this in the same exact way. So I'm going to take some of that yellow first, and these petals are kind of all folded in on each other. So the first two petals are kind of connected towards the bottom. So I'm going to focus on those first, get a layer of yellow down, and then just start to add a little bit of that orange to the base and a little bit of that red as well, just to get that variation in color. Adding a little bit more darker areas on the edges, because there would be a lot of shadows within the center of this bud. So I don't want all of my shadows to kind of mush together. So I'm concentrating my darkest areas of the outer part being on the outline, I guess I could say. So for the inside, I am going to mix that orange and the red again, because again, like they said, these areas would be darker, being they're kind of folded over right on top of each other. And I'm just going to fill those in pretty much solid, because these are so teeny tiny. Later, when I go in and add a little bit of detail, I will add a little bit more variation to the inside of this bud, just so that you can kind of see all the different petals that are within it. So like I said, I colored the other two flowers the same way, and here is where I don't know what happened. I go back into record, and it recorded at like top speed. very, very fast. I recorded for about 15 minutes and ended up with 39 seconds of footage, so not really sure what happened there. But I slowed it down as much as I could for you guys to still see what I'm doing here. But pretty much I filled in the centers with a very, very dark red, kind of like a maroon red, and a little touch of green mixed in with that yellow. And for the leaves, I'm using 3 different colors here and just adding a little bit of shading on the base of each of the leaves and where that one leaf is kind of bent in on itself. Same thing with the stems and the 2 little leaves hanging from this bud. And then I added a little bit of detail with just the tip of my paintbrush with that really, really dark red. And I'm basically just going over the little lines, and I hated it. So I just went in with a damp paintbrush to kind of smooth those out a little bit. And next I added a little bit of more water and pigment to the background because it didn't spread the way I wanted it to. So I saturated my paper and went in with more of that gray and kind of brought that up a little bit further. Let this panel dry completely, and then I'll go ahead and stamp out my sentiment. There's tons and tons of sentiments in this stamp set, and I know this larger one here is probably meant for the inside of a card, but I love everything that it says about it, and you can see that I've used it in the past, and I wanted to use it on the front of my panel as well. So I lined up that large word as well as the long sentiment there, and realized once I closed my Misty door, it wasn't lined up at all. So I ended up taking that part off and kind of realigned that with my main sentiment or the mother, and then closed my Misty door. And like always, I'm going to stamp this multiple times, being the watercolor paper is textured, and I'm stamping with black dye ink by Simon Says Stamp. This I think this is probably my new favorite for sentiments. It gives you a very, very crisp image, similar to pigment ink, but it's not a pigment ink, so it will dry very, very quickly. Once my sentiment was all stamped out, and I did stamp this a total of 3 times because I just wasn't adding enough pressure here, I'm just going to add a few Dream Drops by Nuvo, and this is Cloud 9, just around my flowers a little bit, just to add a little bit of dimension to the background. And that is it. That is the card for today, guys. Thanks a lot for stopping by, and have a great day. Bye.